Hola, ¿qué tal? Hello there. I'm Rob Martinez, state historian of New Mexico, and this is New Mexico history in 10 minutes. New Mexico's journey to statehood was a long and winding road. It took a while for us to accomplish becoming a state. There were many reasons. New Mexico became a territory of the United States around 1848 and 1850 after the US Mexican War, when the United States annexed about half of Mexico, including New Mexico. Texas became a state fairly quickly, and so did California. But New Mexico, because of the Compromise of 1850, was relegated to being a territory governed by the federal government in Washington, D.C. There were other reasons. Folks back east and here in New Mexico, the military leaders, they did not think New Mexicans worthy of statehood, even though we had enough people to be a state in 1850. We were the wrong kind of people. They considered us savage Indians and mixed blood, fanatical Catholic Mexicans who were unworthy of statehood and unworthy of the gift of democracy. They thought we were incapable of handling being Americans and joining their culture and society. Well, there's plenty of proof to show that this prejudice existed. One military leader in the 1860s said that the New Mexicans should learn to speak English properly, should stop herding their goats, and stop making their homes and churches out of adobe bricks. He even went so far as to say that the United States should go to war with Mexico again and make Mexico take back New Mexico. These kinds of comments would resonate for decades and hold us back. It was an obstacle to us becoming a state of the Union. There would be many attempts. New Mexicans would draft state constitutions, but every time we were rejected. Our population was made up generally of Nuevo Mexicanos, mixed blood Mexican people with roots in Spain and Mexico and right here in New Mexico, and also the native Puebloan population and the descendants of the Genízaro servant slave class who are part of our story too. Add to that Apache, Navajo, Comanche. It was considered a wild place. It was believed that the Apache, Navajo, Comanche populations needed to be brought under control, that they were a threat to colonizing Americans. And let's be fair, those native groups perceived Americans to be a threat, which they were. Well, if you look at the decades from 1850 to 1900, mainly we were Hispanos and Native Americans here in New Mexico. Sure, there were Americans coming from back east on the Santa Fe Trail starting in the 1820s, but there just weren't that many. Up until around 1880, the American population was roughly between 2 to 3% of the total. But the population kept increasing. And in the 1880s, the federal government established an immigration office in New Mexico to attract Americans. And it worked because by 1900, there were many more Americans living here, and it started to become possible to be perceived as a place worthy of statehood. Another thing happened. In early 1900s, an American wrote a very insulting letter about the local population in a newspaper, and New Mexican Eusebio Chacon responded by saying something like, we are not Mexican, and there is no Native American blood in my veins or in our veins. We descend from the Oñate era colonists, the conquistadores, the noble Spaniards of that time. He meant well. He was trying to defend the local Hispanic population and culture, but he also contributed to this idea that both sides, the Nuevo Mexicanos and the Americanos, the Americans, started to foster this idea that the New Mexicans weren't Mexican. Rather, we were Spanish. We were white Europeans. If you look at the census records from 1850 to 1900 for New Mexico when we were a territory, it's interesting that the census documents that the United States used had three categories: white, black, or mulatto, meaning a mix of white and black. Um, Native Americans weren't even counted initially in the US Census. So if you go by US Census records, there were no Native Americans in the United States early on, and obviously that's not true. Well, this starts to happen with the New Mexicans. If you look at the census records for New Mexico, the Mexican population starts to be called white. Every once in a while, you'll see MX or MEX to show that we're Mexican, but nowhere are we called Spanish or Europeans. And nowhere do we refer to ourselves that way. But it adds to this idea, this notion that New Mexicans were a part of the overall European, white Northern European or Southern European population. Again, they didn't have a designation for Latino or Hispanic back then, so they were doing the best they could. But by early 1900s, this idea that we're Spanish starts up, so much so that by 1910, there's another attempt to bring us into the Union, the United States, and it finally works. In 1912, January 6th, President Taft signs the paperwork officially making New Mexico a state of the Union. Arizona would follow shortly thereafter. Well, this is the beginning of New Mexico's primary role as one of the states of the United States of America. We had originally been a community or a confederate group of Puebloan communities, a group of Puebloan communities that initially lived and thrived before the Spanish ever arrived. And then Spain expands her empire to this part of the world, and we become a colony of Spain's world empire. In the documents, we're referred to as a reino or a provincia, a kingdom or a province, but it was not the romantic kingdom we think about in books and stories. It was a political designation, and it was a territory of Spain that was made up of Native American people and from this area and mixed blood Hispanic people, Hispanos, Nuevo Mexicanos of Spanish, Portuguese, French, and mixing with Mexican Indian and Puebloan and Genízaro people, the slave class of New Mexico. So it wasn't like visiting the Reino of Castilla la Vieja in Spain. It was very different. Under Mexico, we were a territory. We were never a state. And then again, we were a territory of the United States for the better part of 62 years or so. So in 1912, we become a state. It struck me when I was preparing for this episode that the United States took over New Mexico 1848 to 1850, and then within about 10 years or so, we would be involved in a horrifying and bloody civil war. The United States exploded into civil war in the 1860s, the early 1860s, and there we were, right there in the middle of it. We had two major battles here in New Mexico. Well, in 1912, we become a state of the Union, and within 5 years, the United States will be involved in World War I, the Great War, and New Mexico will send her people to fight in that war, including my own great uncle Roberto Lovato and my other uncle Ignacio Trujillo. They went to France and fought for the United States, as did many, many Nuevo Mexicanos. So I find that interesting. We become a territory, then we're involved in a civil war. We become a state, and then we are smack in the middle of a world war, contributing to the efforts of the United States of America. Well, that's it for now. We're finally a state. Please join me for more episodes of New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Hasta pronto. Goodbye.